Ride me like you ride your horses. Giant mail order bride, ordered the wild cowboy. Wyoming Territory, 1882, when Colt Madigan stepped off the train expecting to save a desperate woman. He found Magnolia Thornhill, 6'2", owner of 10,000 acres, and the only person in 3 counties who could break a Mustang faster than she could break a man's pride. She bought him with a contract and cash, but the land demanded something neither of them had agreed to, the truth. The dust hadn't even settled when Colt saw her towering over every man on the platform. She sat on a black stallion that looked small beneath her, and when their eyes met across the crowd, something in his chest went tight. He was 5'9" and carried everything he owned in a single bag. She looked like she could split the sky in half just by reaching up. Madigan. Her voice wasn't a question. It was a statement that cut through the noise like a church bell. He walked toward her, weaving between families and freight carts, and stopped at her horse's shoulder. Up close, she was even more striking, sun-bronzed skin, dark hair pulled back in a severe braid, eyes that seemed to see straight through him. Miss Thornhill, I presume. Mrs. Thornhill, widow, 3 months married before fever took him. She said it like she was reading items off a grocery list. You understand the arrangement. I read the advertisement. Every word. Then you know I'm not looking for romance. I need a man's name on my deed, so the bank will loan me operating capital. You need money to send back east to your niece. We sign papers, you stay until spring, then you go. Simple. Nothing about this felt simple. Colt had fought in the war. He'd watched his family's Virginia plantation get torn apart by carpetbaggers. He'd buried his brother and watched his sister-in-law crumble under the weight of raising a sick child alone. He'd swallowed more pride in the last 2 years than most men swallow in a lifetime. But standing here, looking up at this woman who stared down at him like he was a gamble she wasn't sure would pay off, this felt like a different kind of surrender. What if I have questions about how things work? He asked. Then you ask. But you don't question me in front of my men, you don't undermine my authority, and you remember whose ranch this is. She tilted her head. Can you ride? Better than most. We'll see. She nodded toward a horse tied to the post, a bay mare with nervous eyes. Mount up. We're burning daylight. The ride to the ranch took an hour through country so vast it made Colt's throat ache. Rolling grassland stretched to mountains that looked like they'd been carved from storm clouds, and the sky overhead was so big and blue it felt like drowning in reverse. Maggie, he'd already started thinking of her as Maggie, though she hadn't given him permission, rode ahead, her back straight as a rifle barrel. When the ranch finally appeared, Colt felt his breath catch. The house was timber and stone, built low and strong against the wind. Behind it, corrals sprawled out like spiderwebs, and cattle dotted the grassland as far as he could see. This wasn't just property. This was a kingdom. My father built this from nothing, Maggie said, not looking at him. Spent 30 years breaking his back so I'd have something that mattered. Then he died, and every man from here to Cheyenne started treating me like I was playing dress-up in his boots. You don't strike me as someone who plays at anything. She glanced back. And for just a second, something flickered in her eyes. Not quite gratitude, not quite trust, but something close. They dismounted at the main house, and a Mexican man with silver threading through his dark hair stepped out. Patrona, this him? Tomas, meet Colt Madigan, my husband, as of tomorrow. She said the word husband like it tasted strange in her mouth. Show him the bunkhouse. Make sure he understands the rules. Tomas nodded, amusement dancing at the corners of his eyes. Come on, amigo. Let the Patrona rest. She's been riding fence for 3 days straight. As Colt followed Tomas across the yard, he looked back once. Maggie stood on the porch, one hand resting on the post, watching him. Even from a distance, even backlit by the setting sun, she looked alone in a way that made his chest hurt. The bunkhouse smelled like leather and tobacco and the particular loneliness of men who work too hard to form attachments. Tomas showed him an empty cot in the corner, a trunk for his belongings, and a wash basin that had seen better days. She seems formidable, Colt said carefully. Tomas laughed, low and knowing. Formidable, that's a kind word for it. Maggie Thornhill is the toughest person I've ever known, man or woman. But she's also the loneliest. He fixed Colt with a look that said more than words could. You hurt her, and I'll make sure you regret it. You understand? I'm not here to hurt anyone. I'm here to sign papers and earn money for my niece. That's what you think now. Tomas clapped him on the shoulder. But this land has a way of changing what people come here for. You'll see. That night, lying on the narrow cot while other ranch hands snored around him, Colt stared at the ceiling and thought about Maggie's hands on the reins, scarred, capable, sure. He thought about the way her voice had cracked, just barely, when she mentioned her father. He thought about how she'd looked at him on the platform, not with hope or desperation, but with the weary resignation of someone who'd learned to expect disappointment. Across the yard, Maggie sat by the fire in the main house and held the contract in her hands. Husband required. Must ride, must read, must respect a bargain. She'd written those words 3 months ago, when the bank had laughed in her face for the 3rd time. When Silas Cutthroat had cornered her at the feed store and told her she'd be begging him for mercy by Christmas. She'd sworn she'd never beg, never surrender, never give these men the satisfaction of watching her fail. But as she stared at the flames, she couldn't stop thinking about the way Colt Madigan had looked at her. Not with pity, not with the hungry calculation she'd seen in other men's eyes, just curiosity, like he was trying to figure her out and didn't mind taking his time doing it. It terrified her, because Magnolia, Thornhill had learned long ago that hope was the most dangerous thing you could carry. Hope made you vulnerable, made you believe that maybe, just maybe, someone would see past the giant and find the woman underneath. And she couldn't afford to be vulnerable. Not now, not with everything on the line. So she folded the contract, placed it in the drawer, and went to bed, telling herself that tomorrow would be simple. They'd sign papers. They'd shake hands. They'd maintain their distance. She almost believed it. The wedding happened fast, like ripping off a bandage. Judge Hewitt spoke words that should have meant something: love, honor, cherish. But all Colt could focus on was the way Maggie's jaw was clenched so tight he thought her teeth might crack. She wore a dark blue dress that looked like it had been pulled from the back of a closet, and her hands stayed fisted at her sides the entire time. When the judge said, "You may kiss the bride," she stuck out her hand instead. Colt took it. Her palm was rough and warm, and for 3 heartbeats neither of them let go. Her eyes met his, and in that brief moment he saw something flicker behind the armor, uncertainty, maybe, or fear that she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. Then she dropped his hand and turned to Tomas. "It's done. Get the papers filed. No celebration, no cake, no pretending this was anything other than what it was, a business transaction wrapped in vows that meant nothing." Except Colt couldn't shake the feeling that they meant more than either of them was willing to admit. Rosa, Tomas's wife, pressed a bundle into Maggie's hands. Even a paper marriage deserved something sweet. Inside were empanadas, still warm, smelling like cinnamon and promises. Maggie's face softened for half a second before the walls slammed back up. "We've got work. Cattle need moving before the weather turns." The work was punishing. The sun beat down like a hammer on an anvil, and the cattle were stubborn, scattering every time they got close to the southern pasture. But Colt moved like he'd been born on horseback, reading the land, anticipating where the herd would break, guiding his mount with his knees instead of the reins. Maggie watched him from across the herd, and something in her chest pulled tight. Most men she hired either spent the day trying to prove they were better than her, or sulked because they weren't. Colt just worked. No posturing, no complaints. Just quiet competence that made her wonder what kind of life he'd lived before he ended up here. When a young steer bolted toward a ravine, Colt didn't hesitate. He spurred his horse forward, cut the animal off at an impossible angle, and brought it back to the herd with a patience that shouldn't have surprised her but did. She rode up beside him, and for a moment they moved in sync, two people who understood the language of horses and cattle and land that didn't forgive mistakes. "Where'd you learn to ride like that?" Her voice came out rougher than she intended. "Virginia. My family bred horses before the war." His face went tight. "Thoroughbreds, some of the finest in the South. War take it. War and everything after." He didn't elaborate and she didn't push, but she understood. Loss had a way of carving people hollow, and Colt Madigan carried that hollowness like a second skin. They worked until the sun bled red across the horizon, turning the grassland into an ocean of copper and gold. When they finally stopped by a creek that cut through the land like a scar, both horses and riders were spent. Maggie dismounted and, crouched by the water, scooping it into her hands and drinking deep. When she stood, droplets clung to her chin, catching the dying light, and Colt found himself staring longer than he should have. "You'll do," she said finally. "That a compliment? It's a fact." She met his eyes, and there was something raw there, something unguarded. "Most people disappoint me. You haven't yet." The yet hung in the air between them like a challenge and a warning. That night, Rosa insisted they eat together. "Because even a business marriage deserves a wedding supper, and I won't have anyone saying I let the Patrona starve her new husband on the first day." So Colt sat across from Maggie at a table that felt too big for two people, eating beans and cornbread and the empanadas Rosa had saved. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, but heavy with things neither of them knew how to say. "Tell me about your niece." Maggie's voice cut through the quiet like a blade. Colt looked up, surprised. "Emma, she's 8, my brother's daughter. He died 2 years ago, and her mother couldn't manage alone, so she sent Emma to an aunt in Richmond. But the aunt's struggling, and Emma's got a cough that won't quit. Doctor says she needs medicine and clean air. So you came here. So I came here." He pushed food around his plate. "Figured I'd swallow my pride for a few months, send back enough money to get her somewhere better, maybe out west where the air's dry." Maggie studied him across the table, and something in her expression shifted. "My father used to say, pride's a poor man's currency. Doesn't buy food or keep the rain off, but it's all some people have left." She paused. "You spent yours coming here. That takes courage, or desperation. Sometimes they're the same thing." The words hung between them, and Colt realized this was the most honest conversation he'd had with anyone in years. Not polite, not careful, just two broken people admitting they were broken. "Why'd you really need a husband?" he asked quietly. "It's not just the bank, is it?" Maggie's jaw tightened, but she didn't look away. "Silas Cutthroat owns half this territory and wants the other half. He's been buying up everyone's debt, squeezing them until they sell. He bought mine 3 months ago from a bank in Cheyenne." Her hands fisted on the table. "Gave me until Christmas to pay it off. $20,000. If I don't, he forecloses, and everything my father built becomes his." Colt felt the air leave his lungs. 20,000? I can make it. If the herd survives winter, if the prices hold, if nothing goes wrong." She laughed, bitter and sharp. "But banks don't loan operating capital to women, and cutthroats made sure everyone knows I'm one bad season from ruin. So I needed you, needed your name on the deed so the bank would give me enough to make it through. And if we don't make it, then you take your $500 and go, and I lose everything." The weight of it settled on Colt's shoulders like a yoke. This wasn't just about a business arrangement anymore. This was about survival, about a woman who'd been backed into a corner and was fighting with everything she had. "What if I stayed?" The words came out before he could stop them. "After spring, what if I stayed and we actually tried to make this work?" Maggie's eyes went wide, then shuttered. "Don't. Don't what? Don't offer me hope." Her voice cracked. "I've spent 2 years learning not to hope for things I can't have. Don't stand there and make me start again." Colt stood and crossed to her side of the table. She looked up at him, and in the lamplight he saw the truth she'd been hiding behind all that strength and steel. She was terrified. Terrified of failing. Terrified of being alone. Terrified that she'd spent so long being the giant that no one would ever see the woman underneath. "I'm not offering hope," he said quietly. "I'm offering partnership, real partnership, not paper and signatures, the kind where we face this together." "You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying." He held out his hand. "I know what it's like to lose everything, to feel like you're carrying the world on your shoulders and one wrong step will crush you. I know what it's like to be so tired you can't remember what it feels like not to be tired. And I know what it's like to meet someone who understands that without you having to explain it." Maggie stared at his hand like it was a snake that might bite. Then slowly she reached up and took it. Her hand was shaking, and Colt realized that Magnolia Thornhill, the woman who could break horses and run a 10,000-acre ranch and stare down bankers without flinching, was afraid of this. Afraid of letting someone in, afraid of being seen. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered, "how to be anything other than what I've had to be. Then we'll figure it out together." And there, in the lamplight, with the night pressing against, the windows and the weight of impossible odds crushing down on both of them, something shifted. The contract was still real, the danger was still real. But so was this, two people choosing each other not out of desperation, but out of recognition. They didn't kiss, didn't make promises they couldn't keep. They just stood there, hands clasped, and let themselves believe that maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to carry everything alone anymore. 3 weeks into the marriage, winter arrived like a fist through glass. The temperature dropped 20 degrees overnight, and the wind came howling down from the mountains with teeth that could strip flesh from bone. Colt woke in the bunkhouse to frost coating the inside of the windows and his breath visible in the air. Outside, Maggie was already working. He found her in the barn, pitching hay to the horses, her movements sharp and efficient despite the cold. She'd been up since before dawn, he realized. Probably hadn't slept more than a few hours. "Storm's coming," she said without looking at him. "Big one. We need to move the herd closer to the windbreaks, or we'll lose half of them." They rode out into wind that felt like knives. The cattle were scattered across the eastern pasture, heads down against the weather, and getting them to move was like trying to turn a river upstream. But Colt and Maggie worked in rhythm now, anticipating each other's movements, communicating with glances and subtle gestures instead of words. By midday, the sky had turned the color of old bruises. Snow began to fall, not the gentle kind from children's stories, but hard, driven flakes that stung exposed skin and made it impossible to see more than a few yards ahead. "We're not going to make it back before this hits full force," Colt shouted over the wind. Maggie nodded toward a dark shape in the distance. "Line shack. A half-mile north. We can wait it out there." They pushed the herd into the shelter of a ravine where cottonwoods would break the worst of the wind, then rode hard for the shack. By the time they stumbled inside, both were coated in snow and shaking from cold. The shack was barely more than 4 walls and a roof, but it had a potbelly stove and a stack of firewood someone had left for emergencies exactly like this. Colt got the fire going while Maggie tended the horses, bringing them into the small lean-to attached to the shack. When she came back inside, her lips were blue, and her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't work the buttons on her coat. "Here." Colt's hands covered hers, steady and warm. He unbuttoned her coat, helped her out of it, then wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. "Sit by the fire. You're half frozen. The cattle are safer than we are right now. Sit down, Maggie." She sat, and he saw how close she'd come to pushing too hard. She'd been running on nothing but will and coffee for weeks, driving herself past exhaustion because she didn't know how to do anything else. He made weak coffee from the emergency supplies and pressed the tin cup into her hands. She drank it without tasting it, staring at the fire like it held answers to questions she didn't know how to ask. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, the silence stretched between them like a living thing. "I'm going to lose it," Maggie said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "The ranch, everything. I've been running the numbers every night and I can't make them work. Even if the herd survives winter, even if prices hold, I'm still short. I'm going to lose everything my father built, and there's nothing I can do to stop it." Colt set down his own cup and moved closer. "Then we'll figure something else out." "There is nothing else. I've sold everything that isn't nailed down. I've borrowed from everyone who'll lend. I've worked myself to the bone, and it's still not enough." Her voice cracked. "I'm not enough." "Stop." The word came out harder than he intended. "Don't say that. It's true. Everyone was right. A woman can't run a ranch this size." "I was foolish to think I could." Colt grabbed her shoulders and turned her to face him. "Listen to me. You are the strongest person I've ever met. Man or woman, it doesn't matter. You've held this place together through drought and debt, and every man in 3 counties trying to see you fail. You've done the work of 5 people, and you've done it without complaint. So don't you dare sit here and tell me you're not enough." Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she tried to turn away, but he wouldn't let her. "I'm so tired," she whispered. "I'm so tired of being strong, of being the giant everyone expects me to be. Just once, I want someone to tell me it's okay to stop carrying everything alone." Something inside Colt broke open. He pulled her against his chest, and she came apart in his arms, great shuddering sobs that sounded like they'd been trapped inside her for years. He held her, while the storm screamed outside and the fire crackled, and she finally let herself be vulnerable. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore," he said against her hair. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." She pulled back enough to look at him, her face blotchy and wet. "The contract, damn the contract." His thumb brushed a tear from her cheek. "I stopped caring about the contract 2 weeks ago. I care about you. I care about this ranch. I care about making this work, not because of money or paperwork, but because I want to. Because when I look at you, I don't see a giant or a woman playing at being a rancher. I see someone worth fighting for. You barely know me. I know enough. I know you take your coffee black and you check on the horses every night before bed, even though Thomas already did it. I know you carry your father's watch in your pocket and touch it when you're worried. I know you pretend you don't care what people think, but it cuts you every time someone calls you unfeminine or too much. I know you're terrified of being alone, but you're more terrified of letting someone close enough to hurt you." Maggie stared at him, her breath coming in short gasps. "How do you see all that?" "Because I look, really look, not at what you show everyone else, but at who you are underneath." The space between them felt charged, electric. Maggie's eyes dropped to his mouth, then back up to his eyes. "The contract says we can't. I don't care about the contract. If we break it, everything becomes complicated. It's already complicated, Maggie. It became complicated the moment you put your hand in mine at that table and let yourself shake." She closed her eyes, warring with herself. Years of keeping people at arm's length. Years of protecting herself. Years of believing she was too much for anyone to want. Then she opened her eyes and made a choice. She kissed him. It wasn't gentle. It was desperate and hungry, and full of every feeling she'd been holding back. Colt responded in kind, his hands coming up to frame her face, his mouth slanting over hers like he'd been starving and she was sustenance. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Maggie touched her forehead to his. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "Neither do I. But we'll figure it out." He pulled back enough to meet her eyes. "I meant what I said. I'm not going anywhere. Whatever it takes to save this ranch, we'll do it together. And whatever happens after, we'll face that together too." Something in Maggie's face transformed. The armor cracked wide open, and underneath was the woman she'd been hiding, vulnerable and fierce and achingly beautiful. "Then ride me like you ride your horses." "Colt Madigan," she said, her voice rough with emotion and desire. "No fear, no holding back. Because I'm done pretending I don't want this. done pretending I don't want you, and there, with the storm raging outside and the fire burning low, they gave in to everything they'd been fighting. Not because the contract said they should, not because it was practical or logical or part of any plan, but because sometimes, in the middle of impossible odds and brutal winters and crushing debt, two people find each other and decide that maybe, just maybe, love is the one thing worth risking everything for. The storm lasted 3 days. They spent it wrapped in each other, talking and laughing and learning the geography of each other's scars. Maggie told him about her father, about growing up too tall and too strong and never quite fitting anywhere. Colt told her about Virginia, about watching everything he'd known burn, about the guilt of surviving when his brother didn't. And they made plans, real plans, not about how to survive the winter or pay off the debt, but about what they'd build together when they did, about the life they'd create, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. When the storm finally broke, they rode back to the ranch changed. Anyone with eyes could see it, the way they moved together, the way they looked at each other, the way they'd stopped being two separate people, fighting alone, and become something stronger. Rosa took one look at them and smiled. "About time," she muttered. Thomas just clapped Colt on the shoulder. "Told you the land changes what you come here for." And Maggie, standing in the yard with her hand in Colt's, finally let herself believe that maybe she didn't have to be invincible. Maybe being loved meant being seen, all of her, the giant and the woman, the strength and the fear, and being chosen anyway. Christmas Eve arrived with clear skies and temperatures cold enough to freeze spit before it hit the ground. Maggie stood in the barn, going over the books one more time, her finger tracing columns of numbers that refused to add up the way she needed them to. $20,000 due by midnight. She had $18,342. She was $1,700 short. $1,700 might as well have been $17,000. The bank didn't deal in almosts. Colt found her there an hour before sunset, her shoulders hunched over the ledger, like she could will the numbers to change. "We're short," she said without looking up. "I've counted 3 times. We're still short." He didn't say anything, just pulled a folded envelope from his inside pocket and set it on the ledger. Maggie looked at it like it might bite her. "What's this?" "Open it. Inside were bills." She counted them twice, her hands starting to shake. $2,000. "Where did you—" Her voice broke. "Colt, this is the money I was saving to bring Emma out west, and a loan against my share of the spring calf crop that Tomas helped me arrange with a cattleman in Cheyenne." "No." She shoved the envelope back at him. "No, you can't. Emma needs this. Your niece needs medicine, and Emma will be fine. I already wrote to her aunt, told her to use what I sent before to get Emma through spring. When the calves sell, I'll send more." He pushed the envelope back toward her. "Right now you need this more. We need this. But the contract, your $500, you came here for that money, I came here for that money. I'm staying for you." He took her face in his hands. "Don't you understand? This stopped being about contracts and money the moment you let me see who you really are. This ranch is your father's legacy. It's your heart. And I'll be damned if I let Silas Cutthroat take it from you when we're this close." Maggie's eyes filled with tears. "What if we fail anyway? What if next year is worse? What if I can't pay you back? Then we'll deal with it together. That's what partners do." She kissed him then, hard and desperate and full of gratitude and love and fear all mixed together. When she pulled back, she was crying and laughing at the same time. "You're either the bravest man I've ever met or the most foolish. Probably both." He grinned. "Now let's go pay off that debt before I change my mind." They rode into town as the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered streets in shades of gold and pink. The bank was about to close, but Maggie pounded on the door until the manager, a thin man named Pritchard, opened it with an irritated expression. "Mrs. Thornhill, I wasn't expecting. I'm here to pay off my debt." She dropped the satchel on his desk with a satisfying thud. "Every cent, count it." Pritchard's eyes widened. He counted slowly, his expression shifting from skepticism to disbelief. When he finished, he looked up at her with something almost like respect. "It's all here. 20,000 exactly. I'll draw up the release papers." While they waited, Silas Cutthroat walked in. He was a big man, with a face like weathered leather, and eyes that calculated the worth of everything they saw. When he spotted Maggie, his mouth curved into a smile that had nothing kind in it. "Mrs. Thornhill, come to beg for an extension? Come to pay off my debt?" Maggie stood, drawing herself to her full height. "Every cent. The ranch is mine, free and clear. You've got no claim on my land anymore." Cutthroat's smile froze. "That's impossible. You couldn't have—" "But I did." She stepped closer, and he actually took a step back. "With my husband's help. Turns out a partnership is worth more than you thought. Turns out I'm worth more than you thought." "This isn't over," Cutthroat snarled. "Yes, it is." Colt moved to stand beside Maggie, not in front of her, not behind her, but beside her. "She's paid her debt. Her ranch is secure. And if you come near her property or her cattle again, you'll answer to both of us." For a long moment, Cutthroat stared at them, this tall woman and the smaller man, who stood with her like they'd been forged from the same steel. Then he turned and walked out, his footsteps echoing in the silent bank. Pritchard handed Maggie the release papers with shaking hands. "Congratulations, Mrs. Thornhill. The property is yours." Outside, snow had started falling again, soft and gentle this time. Maggie stood on the boardwalk holding the papers that meant everything, her father's legacy, her future, her freedom, and started to cry. Colt wrapped his arms around her and held her, while she shook with relief and joy and the bone-deep exhaustion of finally being able to stop fighting. "We did it," she whispered against his chest. "We actually did it." "No, you did it. I just helped." She pulled back to look at him. "Without you, I would have lost everything. Without you, I would have faced this alone. Without you—" Her voice broke. "Without you, I wouldn't have remembered what it feels like to be loved. Then it's a good thing I'm not going anywhere." He kissed her forehead. "Merry Christmas, Maggie Madigan." She laughed through her tears. "Maggie Madigan." I liked the sound of that. The ride home took forever and no time at all. When they finally reached the ranch, Tomas and Rosa were waiting on the porch, and from the looks on their faces, they already knew. "Patrona," Tomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "You did it." "We did it," Maggie corrected, looking at Colt. "All of us." Rosa pulled them both into fierce hugs, muttering prayers in Spanish and wiping her eyes with her apron. Then she insisted they come inside for the Christmas supper she'd been preparing. Tamales and roasted chicken and sweet bread that melted on the tongue. They ate together, the four of them, around the table that didn't feel too big anymore. They talked about plans for spring, about the calves that would be born, about improvements to the ranch that they could finally afford to make. They talked about the future like it was something real and solid, instead of something that might be snatched away at any moment. Later, when Tomas and Rosa had gone back to their cabin and the fire was burning low, Maggie and Colt stood by the window watching snow fall over the land she'd fought so hard to keep. "I need to tell you something," Colt said quietly. "About Emma." Maggie turned to him, concern flickering across her face. "I wrote to her aunt before we left for town. Told her to bring Emma here in the spring. If she wants to come, if her mother agrees, I want her here with us. Want to give her the clean air and the space and the chance at something better." He took Maggie's hands. "But that means you'd be taking on not just me, but an 8-year-old girl with a cough and more questions than sense. And I need to know if that's something you want." Maggie's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were pure joy. "This house has been too quiet for too long. Yes, bring her here. Bring her home." And Colt realized that this was what love looked like. Not grand gestures or perfect moments, but two broken people choosing to build something whole together. Choosing to face the future, not because it would be easy, but because they'd rather face it together than apart. 6 months later, Emma arrived on the afternoon train, thin and pale, but with her uncle's eyes. Maggie knelt down to meet her at eye level, which was quite a feat, and said, "Hello, Emma, I'm Maggie. Welcome home." Emma looked up at this giant woman with wonder in her eyes. "Uncle Colt says you can break horses and run a ranch bigger than some kingdoms." "I can, and I'll teach you if you want to learn, even though I'm a girl." Maggie smiled. Especially because you're a girl. Girls can do anything boys can do, and usually better. Your uncle can vouch for that. Emma looked at Colt, who nodded solemnly. Then she looked back at Maggie and smiled, small and tentative, but real. I'd like that. And in that moment, standing in the Wyoming sunshine with her husband beside her, and a child who needed a home, looking up at her with hope in her eyes, Magnolia Thornhill finally understood what her father had built wasn't just land and cattle. It was possibility. It was second chances. It was proof that even in the hardest places, love could take root and grow into something strong enough to withstand anything. 3 years later, when people asked Colt why he'd answered that advertisement, why he'd traveled halfway across the country to marry a woman he'd never met, he always gave the same answer, because sometimes the thing you think will save you ends up being the thing you were meant to save. And sometimes the person you think needs rescuing is actually the one who teaches you how to be brave. And Maggie, listening from across the room, would catch his eye and smile because she knew the truth. They'd saved each other, not by being strong all the time, but by being strong enough to admit when they needed help, by being brave enough to love when love seemed impossible, by choosing each other every single day, even when every single day was hard. The ranch prospered. Emma's cough faded in the clean mountain air, and the story of the giant mail-order bride who ordered herself a wild cowboy became legend, not because it was unusual, but because it was true, because in the end, the best love stories aren't about perfect people finding each other. They're about broken people choosing to be whole together, and that's a story worth telling. If this story touched your heart, if it made you believe in second chances and impossible love, and the courage it takes to be vulnerable, then hit that subscribe button. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story that reminds you what it means to be human, to struggle, to hope, and to love against all odds.